My name is on a sign in Yosemite. I have never seen it with my own eyes, but I know it is there, because the office in El Portal mailed me a courtesy notice 3 weeks after I stopped showing up to work. And the notice said my return was pending. Return pending. Like I had stepped out for coffee. Like I was due back on a trail I had never walked. I worked 1 full season as a seasonal park ranger in Yosemite. I was assigned to a substation called Sentinel Pines, on the back end of a service road most visitors will never see. I worked the overnight rotation for 6 weeks before I walked off the post. During those 6 weeks, the warning signs at my station started changing after dark. One of them warned about a rock fall before the rocks fell. One of them named a hiker who had not signed in. One of them, near the end, used my name and my ranger ID, and the exact time I would be standing in front of it reading it. I stayed too long. I want to say that up front, because that is the part that makes the rest of this my fault. I knew something was wrong by my 2nd week. I did not leave until something happened that I cannot describe without sounding like I belong on a psychiatric hold. I stayed because leaving the post mid-shift was a fireable offense, and being fired in seasonal work means you do not get rehired anywhere in the system. And not getting rehired meant I was going to lose the room I was renting in Mariposa. I stayed for rent. I want that on the record. I did not stay because I was brave or curious. I stayed for $840 a paycheck. I am going to tell you what happened. I am not going to tell you it is true. I am going to tell you what I saw, what I logged, what I should not have logged, and what I did at the end that I cannot take back. If you work in the parks, if you work nights, if you have ever been the only person in a building with a working radio, you will know which parts to believe. I took the seasonal posting in late spring. I had been bouncing between trail crew contracts in the Sierra for 3 years by then, and I was 31 years old and tired of sleeping in my truck between hitches. A friend of mine who worked dispatch out of the valley told me there was an opening for a night patrol position at a smaller substation east of the main corridor. The pay was bad, the pay is always bad, but night patrol came with a bunk in the substation itself, which meant no rent for the season, and it came with a 6 contract instead of the usual 10 weeks, which meant I could finally pay off the dental work I had financed the previous fall. I applied on Tuesday. I had the job by Friday. I should have asked why. The hiring manager who called me was a woman in the regional office whose name I never quite caught, because she said it fast and the line was bad. She told me the previous night ranger at Sentinel Pines had not finished his contract. She did not say why. She said the substation had been understaffed for 2 seasons, and they were grateful I was willing to take the overnight. She used the word grateful twice. In hindsight, that is the kind of detail you remember. People in federal hiring do not usually thank you twice for accepting a job that pays less than line cook work. I drove up to Sentinel Pines on a Sunday afternoon in the 1st week of June. The road in was a service spur off the main park road, gated at the public turnoff, marked only by a brown sign that said authorized vehicles, only in white reflective lettering. The spur ran about 4 miles uphill through pine and granite scree before it leveled out at a clearing where the substation sat. The building itself was a single-story log structure with a metal roof, a covered porch, a generator shed, and a small fenced lot for the patrol truck. There was a flagpole with no flag on it. There was a pit toilet about 30 yards downhill. There was a radio antenna anchored to the chimney with guy wires. That was the whole post. The senior ranger waiting for me on the porch introduced himself as Cole Mercer. He was maybe 55, lean, sunburned across the bridge of his nose, with the kind of mustache that looked like he had not so much grown it as forgotten to shave around it for 20 years. He shook my hand without standing up from the bench he was sitting on. He had a thermos between his boots and a clipboard on his lap. He told me to come inside and he would walk me through the post. The interior of the substation was one main room with a small back office, a bunk alcove, and a bathroom with a composting toilet. The main room had the radio base station against the back wall, a desk with a desktop computer that looked at least 15 years old, a wall-mounted topographic map of the eastern park sector under plexiglass, a metal storage rack along the east wall, and a bulletin board behind the desk that I would later come to think of as the board. The rack held warning signs, stacks of them, trail closure notices, bear activity advisories, rockfall warnings, fire restriction placards, missing hiker bulletins, weather notices, all of them printed on stiff weatherproof plastic. all of them sized to fit the standard trailhead frames that the park used at every junction in the eastern sector. Cole walked me through them like a man explaining where the cleaning supplies were kept. These get pulled and posted as needed, he said. You check the trailheads on your patrol. You swap out anything that is faded or knocked down. You log the change in the maintenance binder. If dispatch radios in a new closure, you find the right sign. You note the trail and the reason. You take a truck out. You post it. If you cannot find the right sign, you make one from the blank stock and you mark it in the inventory. I asked him how often that happened. He shrugged. More than you would think, he said. Trails change. Things get listed. He showed me the incident logbook, which was a thick green hardcover ledger on the desk, half full of handwriting in different inks. He showed me the radio. He showed me where the truck keys hung on a hook by the door, on a heavy ring with a green plastic fob. He showed me the bear boxes outside the kitchen window. He showed me the flashlight charger and the spare batteries and the first aid kit and the satellite phone, which he told me only worked from the meadow about 100 yards south, not from inside the building. The substation has been here since the 70s, he said. The radio reaches dispatch in the valley most nights. Some nights the weather knocks it down. If the radio is dead and you need to report, you take the truck down to the gate and you call from there. Do not hike out at night. Do not go off the service road at night. Do not leave the post unattended unless there is an active emergency and you have called it in first. I asked him what counted as an active emergency. He looked at me for a second like he was measuring whether the question was worth answering. You will know, he said. If you are not sure, it is not one. He walked me through the trail map on the wall. He pointed to the main trails in our coverage area. There were 6 of them in the eastern sector that the substation was responsible for monitoring. Mariposa Ridge Service Road ran along the northern edge. Alder Creek Spur cut south from the road about 2 miles in. Bishop Gully Loop ran the lower meadows. Quartz Bench Trail climbed to a viewpoint above the clearing. Tamarack Cut connected back to the main park road via a longer route. And there was a trail called Coyote Glass that he tapped once with the back of his pen and said was closed. Coyote Glass has been closed since before I started here, he said. You do not patrol it. You do not check it. If you see anyone heading up that way, you turn them around and you radio it in. The trailhead sign is permanent. Do not remove it. Do not replace it. If it is missing, you call me. I asked why it was closed. He said unstable terrain. He said it in the same voice he had used for everything else. But he did not look at the map when he said it. He looked at the corner of the desk. He stayed for about 2 hours total. He showed me how to log a patrol, how to fill out the maintenance clipboard, how to handle a visitor contact, how to write up a missing person report if it ever came to that. He told me my patrol times, 2200 to 0400, 2 loops of the service road and the open trailheads, 1 at the start of the shift, 1 in the middle. The rest of the time, monitor the radio, update the board, keep the log current. He told me he would be back on Wednesday to check in. He told me dispatch would call me at 0100 every night for a welfare check. He told me if I missed 2 welfare checks in a row, they would send someone up. He told me the previous ranger had been a man named Leland Voss, who had finished his contract early and gone home to Reno. He did not say that the way you say a thing that is true. He said it the way you say a line you have said before. Then he picked up his thermos and his clipboard, and he drove down the spur in his own truck, and I watched the dust settle behind him until the road was quiet again, and I went inside to start my first shift. The first week was uneventful. I want to make that clear, because the things that came later did not happen all at once. And I do not want to pretend I knew anything was wrong at the start. The first week was just work. I learned the patrol route. I learned how the headlights of the truck caught the reflective tape on the trail markers at a distance of about 40 yards, so that the signs seemed to flare up in the dark before resolving into letters. I learned which sections of the service road had washboarding bad enough to spill my coffee. I learned that the dispatch voice on the 0100 check-in was a woman named Ray, who sounded like she had been awake since the previous afternoon every time we spoke. I learned that the substation made small ticking sounds at night as the metal roof cooled, and that the generator cycled on twice a shift, and that the pit toilet smelled less bad if I left the door propped open. I posted 3 signs that first week. One was a routine bear activity notice at the Bishop Gully trailhead, because dispatch had received a report from a day hiker about food storage violations at a backcountry site. One was a faded fire restriction placard at the Quartz Bench trailhead that I swapped for a fresh one. One was a missing visitor advisory at the Mariposa Ridge Gate for a woman in her 60s who had been reported overdue from a day hike out of the valley. She was found the next morning at a different trailhead, dehydrated but fine, and I pulled the sign 2 nights later. All routine, all logged, all exactly the kind of work I had been hired to do. The first thing that was not routine happened on the 8th night. I had finished my first loop at about 2300. I was back at the substation, sitting at the desk with the radio on low, working through the maintenance clipboard. The board behind me had 4 signs posted on it: the standard fire restriction notices, a weather advisory about overnight winds, a generic trailhead etiquette reminder, and a bear box compliance notice. I had checked the board myself before I went out on the loop. I knew what was on it. When I turned around to put the clipboard back on its hook, there were 5 signs on the board. The new one was posted in the lower right corner, behind the others, partly obscured by the weather advisory. It was a standard rockfall warning, printed on the same plastic stock as everything else in the rack. It read Rockfall the reported, Alder Creek Spur, Upper Switchback, use caution. The date stamp at the bottom was that night's date. The time stamp said 23:47. It was 23:22 on my watch. I stood there for a minute looking at it. My first thought was that I had misremembered the board. My second thought was that Cole had come up to drop something off, and I had not heard the truck. My third thought, which was the one I went with, was that I had pulled the sign earlier in the day from the rack and stuck it on the board absent-mindedly while I was sorting inventory, and that the timestamp was a printing artifact from the old labeler that nobody had reset. I had been tired. I had not been sleeping well in the bunk. The timestamp was probably from last season. I took the sign off the board and put it back in the rack. I made a note in the maintenance binder to ask Cole about resetting the date labeler. I went to make coffee. At 23:46, I was standing in the kitchenette with the thermos in my hand, and I heard a sound from the south that I recognized immediately as rockfall. It is not a sound you confuse with anything else once you have heard it once. It starts as a single crack, like a rifle shot in dry air, and then it becomes a long sliding rumble that goes on longer than you expect it to, and then it stops. I checked my watch out of habit. It was 23:47. I stood very still in the kitchenette with the thermos in my hand for what felt like a long time, but was probably about 30 seconds. Then I put the thermos down, and I walked back into the main room, and I looked at the rack where I had returned the sign. The sign was still in the rack. It had not moved. I picked it up. The timestamp still said 23:47. I want to tell you what I did with that. I did nothing with it. I told myself that the labeler must have been set to the current time when I looked at it the second time, and I had misread it the first time. I told myself that rockfall in the Alder Creek drainage was common enough that pre-printing a generic sign was reasonable. I told myself I was tired. I logged the rockfall in the incident book at 23:51, noted the direction and approximate distance, called it in to dispatch on the next welfare check, and forgot about it. I want to be honest, I did not forget about it. I put it somewhere in the back of my head where I keep things I cannot do anything about, and I went back to work. The second incident happened 4 nights later. I was on my second loop, somewhere around 02:30, driving the service road eastbound toward the Bishop Gully trailhead. The headlights were catching the reflective trail markers at their usual intervals, and the radio was quiet. And I was thinking about whether I had enough cash to get the brakes on my personal truck looked at before the season ended. About a quarter mile before the Bishop Gully turnout, the headlights caught a sign at a trail junction I did not recognize. I want to explain something about the eastern sector. I had been driving that road every night for almost 2 weeks at that point. I knew the junctions. There were 6 trail junctions off the service road, and I knew the order of them. And I knew which trailheads had signs and which ones were just unmarked wide spots in the road. The headlights were catching a junction between Bishop Gully and Mariposa Ridge that had never been marked before. There was a metal signpost standing about 4 feet off the shoulder, with a reflective trailhead marker mounted on it, and a smaller plastic warning sign beneath it. I slowed the truck. I stopped maybe 20 feet short of the post. I sat there with the engine running and looked at it. The trailhead marker said Coyote Glass Trail in white lettering on brown. There was a small carved arrow pointing into the trees on the south side of the road. The warning sign beneath it said trail closed, night access denied, ranger response required. Coyote Glass was the closed trail, the one Cole had told me not to patrol. The one that was supposed to have a permanent trailhead sign that I was not to touch. The trailhead for Coyote Glass was not at that junction. It was 4 miles in the other direction, on the north side of the road, near the upper end of the service spur. I had driven past the real Coyote Glass trailhead at least 30 times by then. There was a faded brown sign on a stone cairn and a chain across the path. I knew where it was. This was something else. This was a Coyote Glass trailhead that had not been there on my first loop 3 hours earlier. I got out of the truck. The air at that elevation in early June at 02:30 in the morning is cold in a specific way that I cannot reproduce in writing. It is dry, and it smells of pine resin and granite dust, and the faint mineral tang of snowmelt still moving in the high drainages. My uniform collar was damp from sweat that had cooled, and the metal of the truck door was cold under my hand. I walked over to the post. I shined my flashlight on the warning sign. The plastic was the same stock as the signs in my rack at the substation. The lettering was the same font. The reflective trailhead marker was bolted to the post with the same hardware the park used everywhere. It looked official because it was official. It just was not supposed to be there. I shined the flashlight down the path on the south side of the road. The beam picked up a faint trail bed, narrow, switching back into the trees within 10 yards. It looked like a trail that had been walked by feet, not animals. It looked maintained. Not heavily, but maintained. I stood there for a long time. I could hear the distant sound of water from the Alder Creek drainage to the south, and the wind moving through the upper branches of the pines, and the truck engine ticking behind me as it cooled. Because I had killed the ignition without remembering to, there was nothing else. I walked back to the truck. I picked up the radio handset. I called dispatch. Sentinel Pines to dispatch, I said. Possible signage anomaly at the Bishop Gully Junction. Stand by. There was a long pause. Ray's voice came back tired and slow. Go ahead, Sentinel Pines. I have a Coyote Glass trailhead marker at the Bishop Gully Junction, I said. North side of the service road, about a quarter-mile west of the Bishop Gully turnout. Trail closure sign attached. Night access denied. Ranger response required. There is a footpath behind it. Another pause. Longer. Sentinel Pines, can you confirm location? I confirmed it. I gave her the mile marker. I gave her the GPS reading off the truck unit. She told me to stand by. Iced for almost 4 minutes, which is a long time on a radio at 02:30 in the morning on an empty service road. When she came back, her voice had changed slightly. Not afraid, just more careful. Sentinel Pines, can you read me the sign tag? I asked her to repeat. She said every warning sign had a small inventory tag on the back, a little white sticker with a code on it that the maintenance system used to track which signs had been issued from which substation. She told me to flip the sign and read her the code. I walked back over to the post. I felt for the back of the warning sign. There was a tag. I shined my light on it. The tag was a small white sticker with black printing. The code on it was SP019A. The line beneath the code said issued, Sentinel Pines Substation. The line beneath that said category, Civic Continuity Records. I read it to her. I read all 3 lines. There was a pause that was longer than the last one. Sentinel Pines, she said. Do not interact further with that sign. Return to the substation. We will send a maintenance ticket up in the morning. I asked her what Civic Continuity Records meant. I asked her if it was a department code I should know. She said it was an old inventory category that the regional office still used for legacy stock. She said it in the kind of voice that meant she did not want me to ask again. I did not ask again. I got back in the truck. I drove back to the substation. I did not log the sign in the incident book that night because I was not sure what to log it as. When I got back to the post, the board behind the desk had a new entry on it. A bear activity advisory I had not posted. The date stamp was current. The timestamp was 0241, which was about the time I had been standing at the new trailhead reading the tag. The advisory listed bear activity at a backcountry site I had never heard of, on a trail called Coyote Glass. I sat down at the desk. I poured the last of the coffee from my thermos into the mug. The coffee was cold. I drank it anyway. My throat was dry in a way that coffee was not going to fix. I stared at the bear advisory for a long time. Then I took it down off the board, and I put it in the bottom drawer of the desk, under the spare logbooks, and I closed the drawer. I told myself I would deal with it in the morning. I finished my shift. I slept badly in the bunk. When I woke up at noon, I went and checked the drawer. The advisory was still there. I want to stop and say something here, because I have been telling this in order. And I want to be honest about what was happening in my head during this stretch. I was not afraid yet. That is the part that bothers me now. I was confused, and I was tired, and I was starting to feel the kind of low-level wrongness that you get when you work nights for long enough that your sleep schedule breaks. But I was not afraid. I rationalized everything. The rockfall sign had been a labeler error. The Coyote Glass trailhead at Bishop Gully had been a maintenance mistake by a day crew that was using the wrong inventory. The bear advisory in my drawer had been something I had posted absent-mindedly and forgotten. The substation was old. The systems were old. Cole had told me on the first day that more things got listed than I would expect. I was holding on to those explanations because the alternative was that I had to leave the job, and I could not afford to leave the job. That is the part I want you to understand, because it is the part that everything else turns on. I needed $840 a paycheck. I needed the bunk. I needed the dental work paid off by August. I had run the math on what would happen if I quit at the 6-week mark and tried to get hired onto another seasonal crew before the season closed. And the math did not work. The math meant my truck went back to the dealer and I slept in a friend's garage for the winter. The math meant I lost the next season's posting before I even applied for it. So I told myself the signs were a paperwork problem, and I kept showing up. Cole came up on Wednesday, like he said he would. I asked him about the bear advisory in my drawer. I did not show it to him, I just described it. He listened and nodded, and said that legacy stock sometimes ended up in active rotation when the regional office was short on printing, and that I should set anything that did not match a current incident aside and not post it. I asked him about civic continuity records. He did not look up from his clipboard. He said it was an old inventory category. He said the park system inherited a lot of legacy categories from departments that had been folded into other agencies. He said not to worry about it. I asked him about the Coyote Glass trailhead at Bishop Gully. He stopped writing. He looked at me for a long second. Then he said he would drive down and check it on his way out. He did. I rode along. When we got to the Bishop Gully junction, the post was gone. The shoulder on the north side of the road was undisturbed. There were no fresh holes in the gravel. There was no footpath behind it. There was nothing at all. Cole looked at the spot for a while. Then he said sometimes the day crews put up temporary markers for trail work and forget to remove them. He said sometimes hunters and locals put up fake signs to mess with hikers. He said sometimes new rangers see things on their first overnight rotation that turn out to be branches and shadows. He said it in the voice of a man who had said all of those things before and did not believe any of them more than he had to, and was hoping I would pick one and stop asking. I picked one. I picked the day crew. I said okay. He drove me back to the substation and he left. He did not stay for coffee. That night I went out on patrol and the post was back. I am going to skip ahead a little, because I want to get to the part that matters. Between the 3rd and the 5th week, the signs got worse. I do not have a better word for it. They did not become more dramatic. They became more accurate. A weather advisory appeared on the board predicting overnight winds that arrived 4 hours later within 5 miles per hour of the listed gust. A missing visitor advisory appeared on the board for a hiker named Dana Rusk, who, when I checked the day-use log, had not signed in at any trailhead in the eastern sector. 2 days later, the Valley Dispatch called in a report of an overdue hiker named Dana Rusk, who had last been seen at the Bishop Gully trailhead at 0900 that morning. She was located the following day. She had been on Bishop Gully when she signed in. She had not been on Bishop Gully when she went missing. She had been found, alive but disoriented, at the upper end of a trail she could not name, which she described to the searchers as a narrow path through black rock that reflected the sun like glass. I do not know what happened to her after that. I do not know if anyone ever told her what trail she had been on. The advisory I had posted with her name on it came down the next day on dispatch's orders, and the incident report I filed went into a folder I never saw again. I started writing things down that I was not supposed to write down. I kept a small spiral notebook in the inside pocket of my jacket, and I wrote the time and content of every sign that appeared on the board without my action. I wrote the inventory codes on the backs of the signs when I could see them. The codes were almost all in the SP019 series, SP019A, SP019B. The category line on all of them said Civic Continuity Records. I started flipping every sign in the rack to check the codes. About a third of the signs in the rack carried that category tag. I had not noticed them before because I had never had a reason to look. The other 2/3 were standard park inventory. I tried looking up Civic Continuity on the substation computer one night when the radio was quiet. The internet at Sentinel Pines was a satellite uplink that barely loaded a search page. What I could get to was a single archive document, a scanned PDF of an interagency transfer notice from 1978, in which the Department of Civic Continuity had transferred custody of certain signage inventories to the National Park Service for the purposes of, and I am quoting from memory here because I never printed the page, ongoing field designation of contingent sites. The document had a stamp on it that I could not read because the scan was bad. I tried to find anything else about the department. There was nothing, no homepage, no directory entry, no staff listing. There was one passing reference in a forum post about old federal records storage that mentioned a Harrow Municipal Records Annex as a related facility, and a single line in a comment thread that said the Department of Civic Continuity had been administratively absorbed into something called civil storage in the early 80s. That was all I could find. I closed the browser. I never looked again. The 5th week is when the signs became personal. It happened on a Tuesday night. I had been on shift since 2200. I had done my first loop. I had come back to the substation at about 23:30. I had made coffee. I had sat down at the desk. I had picked up the maintenance clipboard. The board behind the desk had 4 signs on it, all of which I had posted myself, all of which I knew. At 23:52, I turned around to file the clipboard, and there were 5 signs on the board. The new one was a ranger response notice. It was the first one I had ever seen on the board for our own substation. The format was standard. The trail line said Alder Creek Spur, upper switchback. The incident line said incident active. Subject advised, return pending. The response line said ranger response required, unit SP19. The timestamp said 0114. The name line at the bottom said Mercer A, Ranger ID 4471, vehicle SP3. My name is Andrew Mercer. My Ranger ID was 4471. The patrol truck assigned to Sentinel Pines was SP3. The timestamp was about an hour and 20 minutes in the future. I sat down on the floor. I want to be honest about that. I did not stagger or fall. I sat down on the floor on purpose, with my back against the desk, because my legs were not going to hold me in a normal posture, and I did not want to fall and hit my head on something. I sat there for a while. I do not know how long. I remember the floor was cold through my uniform pants. I remember the generator cycled on while I was sitting there, and the lights brightened slightly. I remember thinking very clearly that I was not going to drive out to the Alder Creek Spur at 0114, and that as long as I did not drive out there, the sign was wrong. And a sign being wrong was a paperwork problem, and paperwork problems were survivable. I got up. I took the sign off the board. I put it in the bottom drawer of the desk with the bare advisory from the 2nd week. I closed the drawer. I sat down at the desk and I opened the incident logbook to the current page, and I picked up a pen and I wrote a log entry for that night that read in my handwriting, dated and timed for 23:55. Station observation. No active incident. Patrol unit remaining on post. Signage anomaly noted and secured. I did this because I wanted there to be a written record, in my own hand, in the official book, of where I was and what I was doing, so that when the sign in the drawer turned out to be wrong, there would be evidence. I was not thinking clearly. I want you to understand that. I was operating on the same logic I had been operating on for 5 weeks, which was that paperwork would protect me from paperwork. I thought if I put my own version of events into the official record first, the system would have to honor mine. I went back to the board. I posted my 4 signs. I sat down. I drank my coffee. I tried to read a paperback I had brought with me. I watched the clock. At 0114, nothing happened. The radio was quiet. The generator was off. The wind was moving through the pines. I was sitting at the desk reading a paperback I cannot remember the title of. At 0115, I looked at the clock and I felt something loosen in my chest that I had been holding tight for over an hour, and I almost laughed because I had been right. The sign was wrong. The system was wrong. I was here, on post, doing my job, and the sign had been a glitch, a paperwork problem, an inventory error, and the official record was going to back me up because I had written it myself. At 0116, the radio came on. It was dispatch. It was not Ray. It was a man's voice I did not recognize, and the line was clean, no static, which was unusual at that hour. Sentinel Pines, the voice said, confirming ranger response. Alder Creek Spur, upper switchback. Unit SP3, Mercer AID 4471, 23:55 departure. Acknowledge. I sat there with the handset in my hand for what was probably 5 seconds and felt much longer. The voice on the radio waited. It did not repeat. It did not press. It just waited, the way a system waits for an input. I lifted the handset and I said, "Sentinel Pines to dispatch, negative. Patrol unit on post." "No departure, no active incident," the voice said, acknowledged. "Stand by." The radio went quiet. I sat with the handset in my hand. After about a minute, I put it down. I walked over to the desk. I opened the incident logbook to the current page. The entry I had written at 23:55 was still there, in my handwriting, exactly as I had written it. Below it, in different ink, in a hand that was not mine, but that resembled mine the way a careful copy resembles an original, there was a second entry. The second entry was dated and timed for 23:55. It read, "Units P3 departed post. Ranger Mercer, AID 4471, responding Alder Creek Spur, Upper Switchback, incident active." The two entries were stacked, mine on top, the other one beneath it. Both timed for the same minute. Both signed with my name. The signatures were not identical. The one beneath mine was slightly more careful. The pen pressure was different. The loop on the A in Andrew was tighter. I closed the logbook. I walked to the window. The patrol truck was sitting in the fenced lot exactly where I had parked it after my first loop. The hood was cold. The engine was off. The truck had not moved. I had not moved. But the record said I had. I made my mistake that night. I want to be clear about which mistake it was, because I have made several, and I have thought a lot about which one was the one that mattered. The mistake was not opening the logbook. The mistake was not writing my own entry. Those were already losses by the time I made them. The mistake was what I did next. I picked up the truck keys. I walked out to the lot. I started the truck. I drove out to the Alder Creek Spur. I drove up to the Upper Switchback. I wanted to prove that nothing was there. I wanted to be able to come back and write a third log entry in my hand that said I had driven the route at 0130, that I had found nothing, that the second entry was false. I wanted physical evidence. I wanted to put it on the record. The Upper Switchback of the Alder Creek Spur is about 3.5 miles in from the substation. Climbing along the side of a granite shoulder, above a drainage that runs hard in spring and dries to a trickle by August. The road up to it is rough but drivable in the patrol truck. There is no trailhead at the top. The road just ends in a turnaround, with a view of the drainage and a metal information sign at the edge of the parking area that gives the elevation and the distance to the next junction. I drove up there at 0130 in the morning with my headlights on high beam and my window cracked and my hand on the radio handset in case I needed it. The road was empty. The forest on either side of the road was empty. I did not see another vehicle. I did not see another person. I pulled into the turnaround at 0141, and I stopped the truck, and I sat there with the engine and the headlights pointing at the information sign at the edge of the parking area. The information sign was not the information sign. The information sign at the Upper Switchback of the Alder Creek Spur is a standard brown metal park sign with white lettering mounted on 2 posts about 4 feet by 3 feet, with a small topographic inset in the lower right corner. I had read it before. It says Alder Creek Spur, Upper Switchback, elevation 6040 ft, valley viewpoint 0.8 mMi. What was in the turnaround that night was a sign of the same dimensions, in the same brown and white, on the same 2 posts. The lettering was the same font. The reflective coating caught my headlights the same way. The text on it read Incident Active. Ranger Response in Progress, Units 3 on site, subject advised. Return pending. At the bottom where the topographic inset should have been, there was a small printed line that read Entry 19A. I sat in the truck with the engine running for a long time. I do not know how long. The radio did not come on. The wind moved through the pines on the slope above the turnaround. Water ran in the drainage below. The headlights held steady on the sign. I could not look away from the sign, because if I looked away I would have to decide what to do, and I did not want to decide. After a while I noticed that the small printed line at the bottom of the sign, the one that said Entry 19A, had a second line under it that I had not seen at first. I leaned forward over the steering wheel and I squinted. The second line said Transfer Pending, North Point Lighthouse, Night Shift. I did not know what North Point Lighthouse was. I had never heard of it. I had no reason to associate it with anything. But sitting there in the patrol truck at 0140-something on a Tuesday in June with my hands on the steering wheel and that line on the sign in my headlights, I understood, in a way I cannot explain and cannot defend, that the sign was not warning me about anything. The sign was assigning me. The sign was the document that came after I had been processed. The sign was the part of the paperwork that gets posted in the field after the decision is already made. I put the truck in reverse. I backed out of the turnaround. I drove back down the spur to the service road and back along the service road to the substation. I did not look at the trail markers as I passed them. I did not want to know what they said. When I got back to the substation, the lights were on. I had left them on. The board behind the desk had been updated. The ranger response notice was back on the board. The timestamp had been updated to 0141, which was the time I had pulled into the turnaround. The status line had been updated. It now read incident closed, units 3 returned, subject confirmed, return pending. I do not know what subject confirmed means. I have thought about it for 3 years and I do not know. I worked the rest of the shift. I do not remember most of it. I remember filling out the maintenance clipboard. I remember filing the patrol log. I remember the welfare check at 0300, which had been moved from 0100 without anyone telling me, and which was conducted by the unfamiliar man's voice from earlier, who asked me to confirm my status and my unit number, and which I did because I did not know what else to do. I remember the sun coming up. I remember the way the granite on the ridge above the substation lit up pink and then white as the light came through, and the way the smell of the pines got stronger as the air warmed, and the way the radio static thinned out as the upper atmosphere settled. At 0600 my shift ended. I walked out to the patrol truck to do the post-shift inspection, which was a thing I was supposed to do every morning, but which I had skipped most days because nothing ever changed. There was a sign on the driver's seat. It was a standard plastic warning sign, the same stock as everything else, sized to fit a standard trailhead frame. It had been placed face up on the seat. The text on it read Ranger response required. Unit SP019, transfer approved, North Point Lighthouse, night shift pending. The name line at the bottom said Mercer, A, Ranger ID 4471. The category tag on the back, when I flipped it over with shaking hands, said SP019A and issued. Sentinel Pines Substation and Category, Civic Continuity Records. I want to tell you that I quit then. I did not quit cleanly. I did not call Cole. I did not call dispatch. I did not file a resignation. I went back into the substation. I packed my duffel bag. I emptied the bunk. I left the patrol truck keys on the hook by the door. I left my uniform shirt folded on the desk, with the maintenance clipboard on top of it. I left the sign from the driver's seat on the desk too, because I did not want to take it with me, and I did not want to put it back in the rack, and I could not bring myself to throw it away in case throwing it away was the kind of action the system would log as something else. I drove my personal truck down the service spur at 0640 in the morning. I drove past the Bishop Gully Junction. There was no Coyote Glass trailhead on the north side of the road. There was nothing on the shoulder. The morning light came through the pines in long bands. I did not stop. I did not look in the rearview mirror. I drove out of the park through the El Portal gate. I drove south to Mariposa. I went to the room I was renting, and I packed everything I owned into the truck in about 40 minutes. I drove east. I have not been back to Yosemite since. 3 weeks later, the courtesy notice arrived at my forwarding address. It was a single page on park letterhead. It said that my seasonal contract had been administratively closed pending return, that my Ranger D remained active, and that my unit assignment had been transferred. The transfer line said North Point Lighthouse, night shift pending. At the bottom of the page in a smaller font, there was a line that said Entry 19A, return pending. Do not remove signage after dark. There was no signature. There was no contact number. There was a return address in a town I have not been able to locate on any map. I called Cole about a month after I got the notice. I had his cell number from the season. I had not used it before. He picked up on the third ring. I asked him about Leland Voss. I asked him what had actually happened to the previous ranger at Sentinel Pines. I asked him whether Leland had finished his contract and gone home to Reno or whether something else had happened. Cole was quiet for a long time. Then he said, in the voice of a man saying some things he had rehearsed for 2 seasons in case anyone ever asked, that Leland had walked off the post in the 5th week of his contract, and that the paperwork from the regional office had recorded the departure as a transfer to another site. He said the regional office did that sometimes when a ranger left without filing. He said it kept the records clean. I asked him what site Leland had been transferred to. He said he did not remember. I asked him if it was North Point Lighthouse. He did not say anything for a while. Then he said he had to go and he hung up. I have not spoken to him since. I do not know if he is still working at Sentinel Pines. I do not know if there is still a Sentinel Pines. I have looked sometimes, late at night, at the regional staffing listings on the park website, and the substation is no longer listed in the Eastern Sector roster. I do not know what that means. I want to tell you the last thing, because it is the thing that has kept me awake the longest, and because if I do not tell someone, I am afraid I will start to think I made it up. About 6 months after I left the park, I got a piece of mail at my new address in another state. An address I had not given to the park system. An address I had not given to anyone except my landlord and my bank. The envelope was plain. There was no return address. Inside was a single sheet of weatherproof plastic, the size of a standard trailhead warning sign, folded in half. When I unfolded it, the text on it read Ranger Response Required. Unit SBO-19, return pending, subject advised. The name line said Mercer, A, Ranger at 4471. The timestamp was that night's date. The time was 23:47. The category tag on the back said Civic Continuity Records. I burned it in the sink. I do not know if that counts as removing signage. I do not know what the consequences are for removing signage after dark. I do not know if burning a sign is the kind of thing the system logs as a refusal or as a confirmation. I have not received another one. That does not mean I have stopped being assigned. It only means the system has stopped sending the paperwork to me. I am telling you this because I want it on the record, somewhere that is not theirs. I want someone other than the substation board and the regional office, and whatever office is upstream of the Department of Civic Continuity, to have of what happened, in my own words, before any other version of me ends up signed into a logbook I cannot read. If you work in the parks, if you take a seasonal posting, if you end up assigned to an overnight substation in a sector you do not know, check the back of the signs in the rack. Look at the category tag. If the tag says Civic Continuity Records, do not post the sign. Do not move the sign. Do not put it in a drawer. Do not write your name in the logbook in any hand you can recognize as your own. Do not drive out to verify a trail that is not on the map. And if you find a sign on the driver's seat of your truck at the end of your shift, do not read past the first line. The first line is a warning. The lines after that are not for you. They are about you. They were already written before you got into the truck. I do not know if I am still on shift somewhere. I do not know if the version of me that drove out to the upper switchback of the Alder Creek Spur at 0141 came back with the truck. I came back with the truck. I am sitting in my kitchen in another state writing this down. My hands work. My name is mine. I have a job at a hardware store and I pay my rent. And I have not seen a brown reflective sign in 3 years without my stomach turning over. But the courtesy notice said return pending. The sign in the envelope said return pending. The log entry under mine, in the hand that almost matched mine, said return pending. Something is still pending. Something out there, in a system I cannot see, in an office I cannot find, in a substation that may or may not still be on the Eastern Sector roster, has me listed as a unit that has not come back yet. And every night, when I lock the door of my apartment and turn off the kitchen light and lie down in the dark, I think about the sign on the seat of the truck. I think about the line at the bottom that said night shift pending. And I wonder whether the version of me that is still on the roster is the one in the kitchen or the one on the trail. I do not know which one of us is writing this. I do not know which one of us you are listening to.